folks, welcome to another edition of Forgotten Knowledge. For any of you who've ever raised a baby calf on the bottle, you know how much work it is and how difficult it is to keep those calves healthy all the way to weaning. Now, if you can remember how difficult that was, try multiplying that by about 20 to 30. Because my dad, back when my sister and I were kids, my dad thought that not only would it build character, but it would add a little income to the farm if she and I would raise anywhere from 20 to 30 calves each fall and winter on the bottle. And it was difficult to keep them alive, but Dad had a gift like no one I've met since that could keep these animals alive when they got sick. And he didn't use a lot of fancy medicines or drugs or anything. Matter of fact, the most exotic drug I can ever remember us using was a shot of penicillin once in a while, and maybe some sulfa boluses to help with scours. But other than that, it was all stuff that you found around the house. I can remember him grinding up aspirin and feeding it to calves that might be running a fever. He had used kaopectate or Pepto-Bismol if they had a little loose bowel. He might even give them a shot of brandy if they were kind of chilled and wet. So anything to keep them alive, and he was very successful at it. So it made it a lot easier on my sister and I raising these calves, but it was still a lot of work because I can remember until I was about 10, I suppose, we didn't have running water. So we had to draw water out of the well by hand with a rope and bucket, and then heat that water on the top of a propane-powered cook stove, and then carry that heated water to the barn, and that's where we'd mix it with the milk replacer and feed the calves. So it was quite a chore. But Dad was so good at keeping them alive, I can remember even some new veterinarians that might move into the area knew of his reputation for keeping baby calves alive, and they would even ask him for his advice once in a while. And a lot of people didn't know it, but my dad never went to school, never learned to read or write. But that sure didn't mean he wasn't smart, because even today, I think he's probably the smartest cattleman I ever worked around. And I've gone to a couple of pretty good colleges too. But he was a master at it. And everybody in the neighborhood knew that. And they would often call him for advice or help. Well, back around 1960, somewhere in there, 59, there was a gentleman that moved in, bought a creek place up the creek about 3 or 4 miles from us, up Possum Walk Creek. He was from Chicago. He had made a lot of money evidently in that area, and he wanted to be a farmer now. So he moved in, and I can remember sitting around the general store on a Saturday afternoon, which is what everybody in the community did, swapping tales and everything. This gentleman came in, and he was very educated too, and liked to let all of us dumb hillbillies know how smart he was and how many degrees he had and all that nonsense. And he was talking with my dad, and he said, Mr. Crownover, I understand that you're pretty good at raising baby calves. And Dad kind of shrugged his shoulders, kind of nonchalant. He said, well, my kids raise them. You know, I try to help out a little bit. And he said, well, Mr. Crownover, let me tell you something. In farming, as with anything else, you're going to have to get big or get out. He said, how many calves, baby calves a year do you raise? Dad said, anywhere from 20 to 30. He said, I'm going to raise between 2,000 and 3,000 a year and put people like you out of business. And Dad kind of ignored him and hollered at me, and we headed home in the old truck. And even though Dad was a deacon in the Baptist church, I learned some very new and colorful words on the way home that afternoon. He did not like being talked down to simply because he didn't have an education. And so everything went along, about normal for about a month. And then one Sunday afternoon, we'd gotten home from church, had Sunday dinner, sitting around resting, and we heard a knock on the door. And it was this gentleman from the Chicago area that was now our new neighbor. He said, Mr. Crownover, I know you're really good at raising baby calves. He said, I'd like for you to come to my farm. He says, I've got a bunch and they're just dying like flies. I wonder if you could give me some advice or tell me what I'm doing wrong. And even though he had kind of insulted Dad, a few weeks earlier, Dad, being the good Christian man he was, said, yeah, I'll come up and take a look. So he hollered at me, We had this old 2-ton Chevy truck that, matter of fact, same one I talked about making hay here a few weeks ago, had stock racks on it, 16-foot flatbed. And we set off up the creek road to this gentleman's farm. Now, I'm about, I don't know, 9 or 10 years old at the time. And I got to admit, I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. But even I knew what the problem was the minute we stepped out of the truck, because I stepped in the problem. And those of you who've raised baby calves know what I'm talking about. But Dad really surprised me. He started going over to all these calves and looking in their mouth. And I said, knowing what was wrong, I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, shh. So I shushed. He looked in the mouths of 4 or 5 of these calves and he said, sir, where have you been getting these calves at? And the rich old gentleman from Chicago said, well, you know, the normal places you buy baby calves. I've been going to sale barns every day or two, picking up baby calves. I go to 3 or 4 different dairies and buy their calves as soon as they're born. And Dad said, well, that's about right. How much you been given for them? And this, keep in mind, this is somewhere around 1960. He said, well, you know, the going price, $12, $15 a head. Dad shook his head and he said, sir, I don't know how you tell you this, but I've seen it happen before with newcomers. He said, these sale barns and these dairies are probably taking a little bit of advantage of you because they're selling you deformed calves. And the gentleman had a puzzled look on his face, and he looked at the calves and he said, deformed calves? What is deformed about them? Dad said, look in their mouths. They ain't one of them got any upper teeth. And the gentleman went over and looked and he says, my gosh, you're right. What do I do? And Dad said, well, I hate to see newcomers taken advantage of, so I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, all these that you got here that are still alive, I'll give you $5 a head for them. And the guy scratched his head and he said, well, for deformed calves, I guess that's good that I can get rid of them for at least $5, get some of my money back. So we loaded up that 2-ton Chevy truck with I don't know how many calves, but probably our normal supply of calves for the fall or winter, headed back down the creek road to our farm. And on the way back, Dad looked over at me and he said, son, did you learn anything today? And I said, how to take advantage of a neighbor? And he said, oh, no. He said, every one of those calves would have been dead in 2 days the way he was taking care of them. He said, what you should have learned is the very first principle in survival and farming. And that, son, is to buy stuff as cheap as you possibly can. Now, I don't remember how much money we made on those calves that year, but Dad kept almost all of them alive, and we made a pretty good little bit of money. See you next time on Forgotten Knowledge.